What's up everybody, Jeff here, and there has been a Halo-shaped hole in my gaming heart for a very long time now. I actually recently did a video where I talked about video game IPs that I think need a tabletop adaptation, and Halo was one of the prominent games that I talked about in that video. And not long after the video dropped, Mantic announced Halo Flashpoint, as if to answer all of my dreams. So needless to say, when I got to Adepticon, I was super excited to head over to the Mantic booth and to check out the game for myself. Now, I want to talk about why I think this game could be really important for the tabletop gaming industry, but before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about my impressions of the demo that I got to play. So one of the things in the marketing for this game is that they seem to be targeting a very fast-playing and kind of easy to pick up and play game. And I think they really nailed that based on my experience with the demo. First of all, the game plays out on a 2x2 board, and it comes with all of this pre-colored terrain out of the box, ready to go. So this game is supposed to be a representation of Halo multiplayer. So you're going to have a couple of Spartans or other things, and they're going to be going against a fire team on the opponent's side. Now, rather than measuring out your movement like you might do in some war games, in Halo you're going to move a specific number of spaces. And while I think some people won't like that very much, it does really speed up the pace of the game and make it very simple to figure out where you can move and where you can't. You can even climb as long as it's not too high by just moving into another space and getting up into a tower to get an advantage and get better shots on your opponents. Now, my understanding is that the core mechanics of the game are based on Dead Zone, one of Mantic's other games. I'm not that familiar with Dead Zone, but the game is based on a D8 system. And typically when you're rolling a check, you're going to roll 3 D8s, looking for a particular target number based on the stats on your stat card. The stat cards are pretty simple and straightforward, and they look pretty nice. It's easy to sort of intuit what most of this stuff means, but there are some keywords that need to be referenced in the rulebook, which seems like it won't be too big of a deal to learn all of those over the course of a couple of games. Now, typically you're going to roll 3 D8s, but sometimes you might have a special circumstance where you get a benefit, and instead of changing the target number you need to roll, you're going to add extra dice to represent that bonus. And I think that's a pretty sleek way to do it because it means that you don't have to do any math to add or subtract numbers from your target. You're just going to form a dice pool. You're going to take your 3 dice and then add a die for each of those bonuses, and then roll, and you need the same number no matter what. And those bonuses might come from things like having an elevation advantage against your opponent or having them out of cover. Now, there's going to be exploding 8s, meaning you get an extra die roll for every 8 that you roll. But when it comes time to resolve an attack, you're going to roll your dice pool against the defender's dice pool, and all of their successes are going to cancel out any of your successes. Once that's done, first you're going to apply the damage to their shields, 1 point of shields per success, and then you're going to compare the rest of the successes against their armor value. If you've exceeded their armor value, then you apply the rest of the damage to their health. Otherwise, the damage doesn't go through their armor. Now, some weapons are going to have extra abilities. For example, they might do an extra point of damage to the shields, or they might have an armor penetration characteristic where it makes it easier for them to get through the armor and do damage to the body. And that's really interesting because it sort of represents a similar mechanic in the Halo video games, where certain weapons have an advantage against shields and certain weapons have an advantage against unshielded enemies. An interesting thing that I noticed while I was playing the demo is that the game uses true line of sight, but when you move into a new square, you can actually choose anywhere in that square that you would like to stand. And that's kind of interesting because I find that in a lot of games, it doesn't take into account that a soldier in the middle of a battlefield would not be standing static in one position. They would be moving around and trying to use cover as best as they could. So often you'll find that a model stops in a particular place, and even though they're near cover, they won't get cover because they're just sort of standing in one place and not moving around. So in this system, you're going to move into the space, and you can choose anywhere in that square that you want to stay. So you can kind of tuck in behind cover if you expect your opponents to be approaching from one side. It doesn't mean that you're always going to have cover because, of course, your opponent could outflank you or get a better line of sight from a different direction. But it means it'll be a little bit more straightforward to make sure that you're sticking to cover and you're not getting caught out in the open as much. Now, if your opponent has too much cover, you could always do things the old-fashioned way and punch them to death. And in this game, it seems like melee combat is going to be especially brutal. When you charge into melee, you're going to get 2 extra dice in your attack pool, and then a lot of melee weapons are going to have a particularly good armor penetration characteristic, meaning that it'll be easier to put those last few points of damage through on an opponent to bring them down. And that makes a lot of sense because if you've ever played Halo, whether it's the campaign or multiplayer, then you know that there's a very common sort of battlefield pattern where you will close the distance on a target while you're unloading your assault rifle, and then when you get close, you will melee them to finish them off. So this is really cool because it kind of mirrors that in a way. And I don't know if there's going to be a concept of backsmacking in this game, but I hope that you can sneak up around your opponent and melee them in the back and give them a one-hit kill even if they're at full health, because that's how it should be. So just based on all that, you can probably see that the game is pretty streamlined and it's pretty easy to pick up and play. I think I pretty much learned the pattern for resolving an attack in 2-3 minutes of them just explaining it to me. But there are a couple of different ways that there's potential to add a lot of complexity to the game. And like with a lot of demos at conventions, we didn't really get into all the nitty-gritty here. But there's definitely a lot more here that I'm curious about, and I want to see what else they're going to do with the system. One of those things is that there are items that you can pick up on the field, and it seems like these are going to be randomly generated in certain positions depending on the scenario that you're playing, just like you'd expect from Halo multiplayer. One of those items was an energy sword, and in order to pick it up, all you have to do is walk into the space with it, and then you have it equipped and ready to go. Obviously, the energy sword is super powerful in melee combat, and it seems like you could probably get a one-shot kill with it if you had a decent dice roll, and your opponent didn't do so well. On top of that, there are a variety of different game types that are going to be available in the game right off the bat, including things like Slayer and Oddball and Capture the Flag. Now, those should add quite a bit of variety to the game, and I'm hoping that that is also going to bring some more depth to it, so that it can kind of keep the interest of people who are looking for a little bit more of a crunchy game. For now, the list building is going to be very simple. You just pick 4 models for each team. But in the second wave of releases, when they start putting out more different kinds of models and adding a little more variety to the game, they are also going to develop a whole point system so that you can do more traditional list building. And that should also add a lot of depth to the game because there'll be many more choices and many more options that you have to start with more powerful weapons or even name characters like Master Chief, of course. So far, the game is just going to come with a whole bunch of different Spartans, but there's also a fire team of banished elites, which are going to be available in the Spartan edition of the game. Now, I got to look at these models at the convention, and I got to say they are really good-looking models. They're all pre-built, but they look like they're really high quality, and the paint jobs of the ones they had on display were really beautiful. I'm super excited just to get my hands on the model so I can paint some Spartans and some elites. It is a little bit weird that they have the Banished faction in the game, and they're going to be elites as opposed to brutes. Because if you don't know anything about the Banished, they're basically a group of the Covenant that split off from the Covenant a long time ago. And they're mostly comprised of brutes, but there are elites in the faction as well, so it makes some sense. Now, they've already said that they're planning to add a whole bunch more stuff to the game, including brutes, and I'm really excited to see what else they're going to bring to the game because there's obviously all sorts of other factions and species that could potentially be added to the game down the road. Now, as I said, they seem to be targeting a very fast-playing and sort of low barrier to entry play style for this game, and that brings me to the whole point of this video, which is that I think this could be a really important game for tabletop gaming as a whole. There are a lot of decisions that they're making with this game that I think make it really interesting as an option to introduce brand new people to tabletop wargaming. That's one of the subjects that I talk about on my channel a lot, is how to bring more people into the hobby and sort of lower that barrier of entry to make it a little easier for them to get involved. And if you're anything like me, then you've probably tried to get some folks that are not tabletop gamers into tabletop gaming, and sometimes it can be a little bit of a struggle. A lot of war games are not super easy to get into. They have a lot of work that you have to do before you can even sit down to play, and then it can take a lot of time to learn the rules, and one game session can take hours and hours and hours. And for somebody who's a little more casual or not super interested in it to begin with, that can be a real turnoff. But with Halo Flashpoint, they're saying that it should take 30 to 90 minutes to play a game, and on top of that, everything that you need to play the game is right there in the box, ready to go. All you got to do is kind of put together the terrain, and that's basically it. You're all set. It only requires a 2x2 table, and the terrain is pre-colored. So if you don't want to paint the models, you can literally just put it down on the table and be ready to play a game. And that's something that I think is really nice for folks who are not that familiar with wargaming and are not into the hobby side, where they want to spend hours and hours prepping to get a game ready. Plus, I don't think the core system will take very long for a brand new player to learn. The movement mechanics are very straightforward, and I find that a lot of times people are intimidated by having to measure things with a measuring tape. And in this case, you're just moving through spaces that you got to count. If you can count to 4, you can do it. Resolving combat isn't super complicated, and I think after you run through it 2 or 3 times, almost anyone will have it down and be able to do it themselves if they needed to. Plus, you don't have to worry about micromanaging or list building. The person that you're trying to teach can just pick out the Spartans that they think are cool and slap them down on the table, and they're ready to go. And then on top of all that approachability stuff, you have the fact that this is a Halo game. A lot of us have a multi-decade-long relationship with Halo, and it's obviously a really well-known video game IP, which is a huge deal when you are trying to recruit new people to this hobby. I think sometimes we can lose track of the fact that the tabletop gaming industry is a lot smaller, like dramatically smaller than something like the video game industry. So the potential to recruit people who are into the video games or used to be into the video games into playing a game on the tabletop is huge. Just the fact that they recognize the characters and the armor and the elites, I think maybe enough to get a lot of people really interested, and then the fact that it's got that low barrier to entry is just going to make the process so much smoother if you want to try to teach them. Anecdotally, I've already heard from a whole bunch of people who are not tabletop war gamers who are interested in this just because it's a Halo game. And that's pretty huge for the tabletop industry, because even if those folks get into this game and never go much further, that's already a good thing. But there's also the potential that some of those people are going to get more into tabletop gaming as a whole. Sometimes all you need is a little taste, and then you're going to dive in head first. And on top of all that, it seems like potentially there's enough depth there in the game that it could keep the interest of somebody who's a little bit more into more hardcore games. Plus, as the game grows and develops, I think we can reasonably expect that they will add more depth to it. So even though it might come off as a little bit more casual just to begin with, the fact that it plays out so fast means that it could definitely serve as a really good secondary game for somebody who's into more hardcore games. And potentially down the line, it could be even more interesting. Now, another thing I want to point out as far as approachability goes for a brand new player is the fact that this game has respawning. And I think that could potentially be really huge for getting new players into the game, because you may have had a similar experience that I have had when teaching a new player a more traditional war game, where a new player will invest a lot of time into trying to learn the system and figuring out how to play, and then something will go wrong while they're playing and they'll lose a bunch of important models in their army. Now, not only can that mean that they're potentially just going to lose this game, but it also means that they're not having the opportunity to play with their toys and sort of utilize some of the abilities or some of the models that they were excited to try out and kind of learn as they went through the demo game. I think this type of thing can be a real negative play experience for new players when they're trying to learn, and it can definitely be a discouraging experience, and unfortunately I think sometimes that can actually hold people back from getting more interested in the game that they might have liked otherwise. But the fact that in Halo your models respawn, it means that something like that is never going to happen. Even if your favorite Spartan charges into battle, takes out one of the enemies, and then immediately dies, they're just going to be able to respawn, jump back into the fight, and keep playing. And even if it means that you're not going to win the objective, you can at least continue to play with all your models and have a fun time while you're losing to the more experienced player. Even if you're more into playing games for fun casually and you're not super competitive, we've probably all had an experience where something goes bad in the game and it means that we just don't get to have any fun. Like, even if you don't care about winning so much, if you don't get to play with your models, then it can be a real frustrating experience. And we definitely want to avoid having those types of experiences for brand new players, so I think it's going to be really cool that they're going to keep their models in the game and they get to keep playing and participating throughout the whole scenario. Plus, the game is going to play really quick, and if they do lose, you can just re-rack and run the game again, and maybe they'll do better on the second try. Now, one of the concerns that I've heard from some folks about this game is that they wish that it was going to be a more traditional war game where you were playing out larger battles between the UNSC and the Covenant, for example. And I definitely hear that concern. I think something like that would have been really cool, but I also think that this game might just be a good starting point for the game, and it's going to expand a lot in the future. We already know that brutes are coming, and it seems like they're already considering things like the Flood and other factions that you might want to come to a Halo game, maybe even the Forerunners. And they have a license for the IP for 5 years, which means there's a lot of potential for the game to grow in that time. And even if they never develop it into a full, massed armies battle game, I don't think something like that would be too difficult to adapt the rule set into. You could just throw down a bunch of these mats and make a much bigger table and then just pick more units for each side of the fight. And I think you could pretty easily turn this into a more traditional war game if you wanted to. Some of the rules might play out a little bit weirder, so they might need a little bit of tweaking, but I think that's something that we could all figure out. One of the questions I asked the guys at Mantic was what their relationship with Microsoft and 343 has been like so far. And they told me that the relationship is actually great, that they've been really good to work with, and they've been supporting the team a lot. And I'm not going to lie, that was a little bit surprising for me to hear. No shade on Microsoft or 343, but I kind of felt like they're such a big company that they'd be a little bit difficult to work with. So I'm glad to hear that things are going pretty smooth, and I think that bodes well for the long-term health of the game. So I'm really optimistic both about how we can use this game to recruit new players to the hobby, but also about what Mantic is going to do with the game in the long run to develop it and sort of add more depth to make sure that people like me stay interested in it as well. But let me know what you think. Do you have any friends that you think might get interested in tabletop gaming because of the Halo IP where they might not have been interested otherwise? And do you think, based on the limited view that we've gotten of the game so far, that there's enough depth to keep the attention of somebody who's into more hardcore games? You can probably tell from this video, but I'm a little bit of a mark for a Halo game, so I was going to kind of be excited no matter what they did with this game. But I'll be really curious to see what other folks think about it, so drop a comment below and tell me what you think, especially if you've gotten a demo in of it for yourself. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because I'm definitely going to be keeping up with Halo Flashpoint going forward. And check out a couple of the links in the description below, like the merch store and the Patreon, if you want to support the channel directly. On that note, I'd like to send a huge thank you to the Extremely Cool Kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatized, Devin, and the Spilled Paint Pot. And thanks for watching.